Welcome back to our daily devotions today. So far this week on our journey looking at holiness, we have thought about the holiness of God and the holy encounter. And these have both focused in on scenes from the Old Testament. And today we think about Jesus, the Jesus who we meet in the Gospels in the New Testament. If it's been a while since you've read one of the Gospels, I really encourage you to do it as a faith-building things to do. Now, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, at about an hour long to read, but they all have a different aspect that they focus in on the character of Jesus. So I really encourage you to look at that. But up to this point, what has holiness looked like? The holiness of God in heaven has been separate, distinct from the mundane things of earth. The holy encounters have been the divine but brief stepping in of God from heaven to earth. But what do we see in Jesus? Up to this point, the sacred and the profane, all the things that you would class as not sacred, have been quite separate. In Jesus, those two things are coming together. Holiness is no longer separate and distant, but in Jesus they are close and connected to the everyday. In Mark 1, right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, there is a demon-possessed man in front of him, and he lets the cat out of the bag that the holiness of God is walking among them. The demon says, "I know that you are the Holy One of God." Holiness looked very different in human form, but it was unmistakable in the spiritual realm. Now, Jesus used the image of salt for a spiritual community, and he was said, salt preserves, salt gives flavour, salt makes something fresher, stops decay, and holiness preserves everything around it. And he really has a go, and he says, what happens when salt loses its saltiness? He says at that point it's pointless, and he's talking about a community that has lost its holiness and lost the thing that preserves it. In the person of Jesus, we see holiness as being a holy reliance on God. Now, Jesus regularly says of his reliance of his Father in heaven, only doing what he saw his Father doing. And Jesus also rebuked anyone who thought they had spiritual maturity that didn't rely on God. As an image of this, he welcomed children to him and pushed those who'd been pushed away by people who thought they knew better than Jesus. Now, these children, their childlike nature showed the people around them that Jesus had his ultimate reliance on his Father in heaven. And this was something to aspire to, not something to grow out of. Ultimately, this was the Jesus who embodied holiness, who was without sin, and also who the world railed against. Now, the image of the cross can be far too easily passed over. It's on jewellery, it's on tops of churches, it's in stained glass windows. But the cross is the ultimate symbol of holiness, because the cross was where the guilty were taken. And Jesus was the first person to be truly guilt-free before God, but was executed by people. He gave his life up for us. And in that moment, our guilt is passed over to the cross. The cross is the place where humanity attempted to snuff out holiness. But if you know the Easter story, we know that darkness cannot put out the light. And it couldn't then, and it can't do it now. So holiness in Jesus looks like holiness come down to earth. Very different from those images that we heard in the last couple of days. but no less an image of holiness. No longer up there, but down here, among us. There is no longer a separation between the sacred and the profane. And over the next 3 days, we're going to consider what holiness will look like for us. And through all of this, we will continue to see holiness through the life and death of Jesus. Holiness in human form. So tune in again tomorrow as we continue our journey looking at holiness.